And so now I'd just like to introduce Patrick Harvie, co-convener of the Scottish Green Party.
At my height, speaking after a tall candidate, I'll just do that. At least there isn't a podium. I usually disappear behind them. I spoke at the police training centre once, and the podium was like that in front of me. It was bizarre. Can I thank you, Claire, very much for your talk. If there's one thing that's even more encouraging than seeing those membership figures throughout these islands go beyond 50,000 now, more encouraging even than the fact that we've got meeting rooms like this filling up around the country in the way that we haven't seen in the past in the Green Party, it's knowing that we've got passionate, articulate, bright candidates coming through like Claire. You've, I think, made a fantastic start to this campaign, and I'm sure that you'll continue to do that in the future. Hopefully as a councillor on Fife Council, but also within the wider party here. As we are looking at those membership figures growing, and as the Greens get some degree of media exposure and pundits and commentators and journalists all start thinking, well, should they be in the debates? Shouldn't they? I don't know. Who are these people? I think a lot of folk who've been following mainstream UK high-level Westminster politics for a long, long time are suddenly opening their eyes and asking themselves, who are the Greens? What are they? Do they fit the expectation that we had? Do they fit the stereotype that we had for a long time? And just on the train on the way over, I was reading another article, who are the Greens, and talking about, well, you've got the green Greens, and then you've got the red Greens, and they're not really the same, are they? Some of them care about climate change, and others just care about poverty. What's all this about? As though these are fundamentally different issues, as though how we live within the world fits into two separate realms, one about the environment and one about the economy or society. I don't think that's ever been true. I don't think that's been true before the age of modern capitalism, and I certainly don't think it's true toward these later stages as what we call modern capitalism looks like it's trundling towards some kind of inevitable conclusion, good or bad. So I'd like to go back a wee bit and give you just a little bit of history of the Greens, really. The Greens were born in 1973, as I was. Pure coincidence. My mum was an activist way back in the early days of the Greens. Not quite in 73, she was busy at the time, but not long after that she got involved with the Green Party. And this was a time when the concept of limits to growth was just beginning to materialise on the global debate about the relationship between human beings, our society, our economy, and the environment that we sit within. The relationship between us and the rest of the world. The idea of limits to growth, that human economies cannot grow forever, that nothing in nature grows forever. And that if we try and grow forever, we will consume ever more of the life support system that, in fact, sustains our lives. We'll destroy and undermine that life support system, and the people who've benefited from the economic activity will not be the ones who suffer first from the collapse of that life support system. And that, I think, is exactly what we've seen in the decades since then. We've seen periods of economic growth. When people talk about economic growth all the time, and it's the one way that we're encouraged to measure success, to decide whether the economy is doing well or doing badly. We don't talk about the level of child poverty. We don't talk about the level of health in our society and what causes it when we decide, is the economy doing well or doing badly? All we talk about, all we're encouraged to think about is growth, GDP, and that only tells you how much money is swilling around in the economy. Is it going up faster? Is it going down? It doesn't tell you how that wealth is being generated. For whom is it being generated? Whose interests is the economy serving? And it doesn't tell you who is being lumbered with the social and environmental consequences of generating that economic activity. So we've seen periods where we've seen year after year after year of sustained growth, And inequality just keeps growing wider because all of the wealth, or the bulk of it, gets hoarded by those who are in the least need. We've also seen periods of recession where we're all told to worry about the economy, where the cuts that are the political response to recession and economic crises hit hardest on the people who didn't gain that benefit. But do you know what? During those periods of recession, like the one we've just come through, that economic inequality keeps on growing. The wealthiest don't suffer recession, pretty much ever. They leave that to the rest of us. They leave that to the rest of society to bear the burden of their own failure. So what we've seen over these decades is periods of economic growth, periods of economic recession, but following a single economic objective, which is to carry on hoarding the wealth in the hands of those who need it the least. And at the same time, we've seen the human economy breaching those basic ecological limits. Climate change is only the most famous example. Climate change is only the one that most people are coming to be aware of now. A basic mechanism in the environment that we've been aware of for 150 years, maybe a bit more, the greenhouse effect. Not aware all of that time that we were actually causing it. It was theoretical for a long time, but we understood the mechanism. It's been a good few decades, though, since we've known that this is happening, that this is being caused by human activity, and that it's a profound threat to all of us. It's also a profound opportunity for a cleaner, healthier, and more efficient economy, and yet, at the highest level, political leaders have sound bites, they have platitudes, they do not have a dramatic, radical programme for transition, because that's what we need if we're not only going to come to live within those ecological limits, if we're not only going to ensure that we have a world that's worthy of handing on to the next generation, but that we're also going to share the wealth of that world more fairly, more equitably, and share the proceeds of the economy that we can run that economy more sustainably and share its proceeds more fairly. That's a massive opportunity. It's only a threat if we fail to act. What we're seeing at the moment, pretty much in every front page in Scotland over the recent days and weeks, has been discussion of oil and the threat that will come from a low oil price to jobs in areas like the northeast. Way beyond the northeast, actually. The consequences of a low oil price will be good and bad. There'll be a mixture of good and bad economic consequences for different people. But the long-term prospect for Scotland, as an economy which is overexposed to a vulnerable industry, the oil and gas industry, is profoundly overvalued because the bulk of the reserves that we have of fossil fuels we simply can't afford to burn if we're remotely serious about our own survival. The most recent estimate that was published, and it's in line with others, just came out a week or so ago, that showed something like 80% of the world's coal has to stay in the ground. Something like half of the world's oil and a third of the world's gas has to stay in the ground, unburnable carbon, if we're serious about reaching restraining the consequence of climate change, holding it back to globally agreed limits. Now, that means we've got an overvalued industry. It's valued according to its reserves, as though all of those reserves will be turned into economic revenue. Well, if that's not going to happen, then we're looking at an economic bubble. And we know what happens when bubbles burst. We know what happens because we've just seen it on a smaller scale with the housing bubble that sparked off the recent economic crisis, the housing and unsecured debt bubble that sparked off that crisis. What happens when bubbles burst is not just economic damage. It's economic damage that the smart buggers in the city of London and around the world are able to burden the rest of us with. They get out from under it and they burden the rest of us with it. Do we want to leave the oil industry in that kind of position, knowing that we depend on jobs that are being created there, but that we don't have a plan for transitioning away to a more sustainable system? Because long-lasting sustainable jobs, sustainable economic justice is only possible if we've got a sustainable energy system and a sustainable economy to run it. I've not seen any government at any level ever get serious about reducing our demand for fossil fuels. Yes, we talk about renewables more, and there are jobs coming through in renewables. There's a good contribution to Scotland's electricity demand coming from renewables now. Controversial though some of it is in some places. Let's face it, there's no energy system that isn't controversial. You talk about coal-fired power stations, you talk about open-cast coal mines, you talk about nuclear power stations, you talk about transmission lines, or renewable energy. There's controversy. Somebody's not going to like pretty much whatever you build to run an energy system. But there is now that contribution from low-carbon, sustainable energy, both to our energy system and to our economy, to the jobs that people want to be able to train for, young people looking to get into that industry. And yet it's being seen as an addition, not an alternative, not transitioning away from fossil fuels, but simply adding into the mix. And that's such a dangerous position to be in. We risk having far more of our country in the same kind of position that the shipbuilding industries in the West Coast are in at the moment, utterly dependent on massive contracts from the military that come and go. Well, our whole economy will be utterly dependent on a here today, gone tomorrow, boom and bust economic model if we retain that reliance on carbon, on fossil fuels, and on the oil and gas industry. We've got to break that reliance right now. And the last thing, the absolute last thing that we can do if we want to build that sustainable future is just have one more roll of the fossil fuel dice with the fracking and unconventional gas sector, as Claire said. The idea that we just have one more go at that risky, dangerous game of getting fossil carbon out of the atmosphere and out of the ground and pumping it into the atmosphere, this is not something that we can allow to happen in this country. There are local environmental concerns. There's an energy balance problem with it, but there's also that wider global challenge. Do we want to live sustainably within ecological limits and share the wealth of the world around us with the people around us? Well, if we do, the fossil fuel age has to come to an end. It has to come to an end. The fossil fuel age, in many ways, is what built modern corporate capitalism throughout the 20th century. This is not the economic model which is serving the public need. It's not the economic model that's serving the common good. And it's not one that is capable of living within ecological limits and ensuring our long-term survival. What can? What can? Because it's really easy to talk about the problems of the world around us as we see them. Well, Scotland, I believe, Scotland is in a prime position with such fantastic resources to be ahead of the curve on the transition that is coming. We've got the opportunity to put our land to so much better use. Ideas like shifting local government taxation away from things like council tax, such an unfair, skewed and basically ramshackle system. It's so out of date, it's got to come to an end soon. Replacing that with a land value tax that allows you to create economic incentives to bring land into economic use, sustainable economic use. Because if you hold a piece of land, if you're Tesco's or if you're the inheritor of a business or an industrial process that's ended and you've got that land, at the moment, you're paying nothing for it. If you're the inheritor of the landed estates, the people who stole the land in the first place in previous generations, and you're just using it for hunting, shooting, fishing for your wealthy friends to come up. If you're Donald Trump, who's decided that the land of Scotland is good for helping, destroying a natural ecological resource, but helping wealthy golfers fly in, play a few rounds and fly out, you're going to have to pay for that privilege under a land value tax. You're going to have to pay for that privilege, and if we set a land value tax in the right way, we'll create incentives for land to be put to the right uses and make it impossible for it to be put to uses which don't serve the public good. It would hugely reimburse those who don't have access to land and make sure that land is used in the most sustainable ways. We've got the opportunity to refashion not just our energy system, but our transport system as well. We talk very often about the price of fuel, and one of the things that's popular about the low oil price is that some people say, well, my petrol bill's going to go down, my fuel bill's going to go down. The most efficient way, the easiest and cheapest way to bring down our petrol costs, to bring down our fuel costs, is to waste less of the stuff in the first place. That's been the case in periods of high oil prices and low oil prices. A more efficient use of those resources is something that we've got huge opportunity for. We've been building the wrong infrastructure that locks people into a high energy demand and a high transport demand. We've been centralising services and economies, locking people into spending more and more of their lives commuting, more and more of their lives travelling, when they could be accessing services locally within their own community. And if we do that, then we start recycling their money. When you spend £1 in your own local community, it recirculates within your community 3 or 4 times. If you're dependent on driving out to the out-of-town shopping centre because it's the only choice you've got because the high street's been allowed to die off, then the pound that you spend is whished straight out of the local economy and ends up in a multinational, in a big corporate balance sheet somewhere. So relocalising our economy means strengthening our economy, means recirculating our own wealth to make sure that we have strong, local, resilient economies which can meet more of their needs from within local resources. And obviously, the opportunity that we've got, not just to generate energy for our own needs, but to export it as well to our neighbours south of the border, to our neighbours right across Europe. The idea of building not the same kind of oil and gas infrastructure across the North Sea, but a direct transmission network so that we can trade renewable energy efficiently across the North Sea. This kind of stuff, I don't believe we can leave to the market. And I don't think we should. I think we're missing a trick with the community and publicly owned share of the energy system that we lost in previous decades, but we can begin to build it again. It's normal for other European countries to own locally and nationally at least some of their energy industry, some of their energy infrastructure. You know, some of those public energy companies are building wind turbines in Scotland. I welcome them. I just wish we had one of our own so that we can start putting some of the profit that the energy companies are making back into the public good. If we did that, and we could begin building it at council level right now, local councils have the ability to borrow that John Swinney doesn't have in the Scottish Government. Local councils could begin to invest in solar panels, in heat pumps, in combined heat and power stations, in the kind of energy infrastructure that will meet their community's energy needs, but will also generate a profit into the bargain to start investing in a more efficient and better quality of housing that people need as well. That investment in housing has been drying up for years. It's drying up from within the Scottish Government as well. It's not been a priority for many, many years. And that needs to come back very, very urgently if we're going to have the decent housing that people need right across Scotland. Using our own resources within Scotland, owning our own assets instead of allowing them to be bought off, snapped up, sold off, packaged off by the private sector for their own interests, and ensuring that we recirculate the profit from industries like energy and transport and housing back into the public purse rather than allowing shareholders to skim off the cream. That's the kind of future that Scotland's got available to it. I think we've got the skills, the resources and the ability to be ahead of the curve in the 21st century, to be building the kind of economic model that will last, that will not only last and allow us to survive within ecological limits, but will allow us to share the wealth of our society, the undoubted wealth of our society, more fairly, more equitably. And I think if we do that, the generation that inherits the country we hand on to them will thank us for it, instead of cursing our name for missing that opportunity. So once again, thank you all very much for being here. Thank you to Claire for your candidacy in the local community here, and to the branch for bringing together this meeting, and I look forward to your questions. Thanks very much.